pleased to give a big round of applause to today's keynote speaker, Professor Emin Guen.
Hello, thank you very much for having me here, and thank you all very much for showing up at 8:30 on the second day of the conference. So I want to talk to you about blockchains, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the hype and where we are today, and the gap in between, and how we fill that gap. So where are we today? We're at a very interesting point in time. If you were to walk around, okay, here we go. If you were to walk around Lower Manhattan or Zurich and you were to observe any two bankers walking on the street, you would note that they are turning to each other and asking, what's your strategy for blockchain? Not a blockchain, not the blockchain, but a word without an article. And the only other word that I know that's in this category is the word God. So it's become quite a thing of its own, and has taken a life of its own. Cryptocurrencies have emerged as a new asset class worth more than $100 billion today. There are hundreds of currencies, 1,600 as of last count last night. About $2 billion of traditional VC money has gone into the field. About $10 billion has been raised in the form of ICOs. That's an amazing amount of crowd-funded resources going into this nascent field. And there's an incredibly rapid pace of development. The systems themselves are very robust. Bitcoin itself has had absolutely zero people running around with pagers. This is very unlike Google, Facebook, and so forth. And despite that, it has had no downtime in the time that it's been up. And the meetings themselves, like this one, actually bring together a very interesting mix of people. You have stolid bankers, we have even a minister yesterday, coming together to the same table with Tumblr operators and darknet market people. And one of the things I like to do is sort of look for indicators from social media to see if there's real grassroots interest in an area. And one of these is an interesting one, which is the number of songs written about a particular topic. There are many more songs about Bitcoin and blockchain compared to how many songs there are about Google, Facebook, and even the free software movement. This thing is really big. So what's really going on behind the scenes? So what I think is going on is we're witnessing the emergence of a new class of systems. So the back end of almost every big technological company is going to change. And if that were the only thing that was happening, then that would happen in the background, and you guys would not mix with my kind. And my kind would do that in the background, and you all would go about your business and thinking that, okay, the back end is now slightly more efficient, we got some efficiencies perhaps, but nothing new, nothing big is happening. But there's another second thing that's afoot, which is we have new financial instruments that are emerging. And on top of that, we have, with smart contracts, the ability to disrupt existing business models. So this is an extinction-level event for many companies whose job is to stand in the middle. And it's going to be, many of them are going to be replaced by new modes that are enabled by smart contracts and the elimination of trust and middlemen. So this is all fantastic. But what stands in our path? Well, okay, so I have a nuanced message to give you. There is a deep field here. There is an amazing opportunity on the side of business and finance. Okay, it's not just CS, it's not just computer science. But at the same time, there's a giant gap between what is being sold to the public and what is achievable today. The systems that we're capable of building with blockchains today are not all that decentralized. They are not that fast. They do not handle as high a throughput as they should. They do not scale to the levels that they need to scale to. If, for example, all of Venezuela were to switch to Bitcoin today, every adult Venezuelan would be able to go to the store once every 36 days. Okay, so this stuff is just not ready for prime time in its current form. So we need fundamental new science to reach what the narrative is actually telling us. Now that path is possible, and I want to give you a glimpse as to what it takes to get there. But before we do that, let me report to you some of the studies that we've done on decentralization in blockchains. Now, the full details are in various papers that my group has published, but I want to talk to you about a recent study that we did where we looked at the amount of decentralization in Bitcoin and Ethereum. So of course, decentralization is crucial in this domain. It's not only crucial for, again, reaching the narrative, but it's also crucial from a legal perspective. The SEC in the US recently announced that the legal rules that apply are different depending on how decentralized you are. So it's essential that we measure the level of decentralization, and it's essential that we understand what's happening underneath these systems. So of course, decentralization then is this unicorn in the name of which many system design decisions are made. So we did this big study to examine just how decentralized the Bitcoin and Ethereum networks are. It's a multi-year study, about 2.5 years of data, about 5 gigabytes of data collected, and so on and so forth. I want to give you just one simple graph, maybe two simple graphs out of this whole thing. We looked at where the mining power is in Bitcoin and Ethereum. And these graphs over here summarize the various different mining concerns and their hash power over time. So every collection of bars corresponds to a miner, and how their hash power changed over the course of our study. So you can see that somebody sometimes lags behind, then adds more hash power, goes up, and so on and so forth. You will immediately notice that the sum total number of bars I'm showing you is less than 20. Okay? So these systems, when it comes to constructing the most important data structure, that ledger, that's so crucial, it comes down to 20 coordinating units that are producing these the actual blocks. So this graph shows the CDF, the cumulative distribution function, for the same data. And you can see from this one a couple of interesting takeaways. The most important one, of course, is this 50% line right there. And to summarize it, it's simply the case that during our study period, Bitcoin's blockchain was manufactured by a sum total of about 19 concerns, 4 of which could together determine the entire contents of the blockchain. So 4 of them would be able to exceed the 51% boundary. The numbers for Ethereum are slightly worse. They come down to about 11 miners, and about 3 of them dominate and have about more than 51% of the hash power. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that if we could somehow put together a system that creates a Byzantine quorum of about 20 nodes or so, we would immediately be as decentralized, or perhaps more decentralized, than these systems up there. And in fact, somebody did just that recently. About a week ago, EOS went online, and it created a lot of fanfare, raised about $4 billion by itself from the public, and it comes down to 21 block producers in EOS. Okay? So these are not very large numbers. These are the kinds of numbers that a master's student working over 2 weeks could put together with the help of some very well-established algorithms and then deploy on AWS, and suddenly you have something that is similar in the number of nodes that are powering that are powering the blockchain production. So clearly, there is a big gap between the decentralization as people imagine it and the actual decentralization on the ground. And I would like to talk to you a little bit about new protocols that actually allow us to scale way beyond these kinds of puny numbers that you see here. 21 is too small, and we need to go up to numbers that are in the thousands range. And the base problem here is the protocols that we had access to just can't scale to that level. And I want to give you a glimpse of a new protocol that can. So I mentioned there are many other protocols. IOTA, for example, is a centralized protocol. It has a centralized coordinator at the moment. There are many copycat currencies, Litecoin, Dogecoin, etc. And all of these come down to Bitcoin reparameterized. They take the Bitcoin source code, they change a couple of things here and there in the name of, quote, decentralization typically, and then they end up having a new artifact that's essentially a replica of the old one, has all of the same faults as the old one. Achieving decentralization and achieving low latency and high throughput at the same time has been elusive. It's very difficult. Now, my group has been pushing the envelope here, and when we actually try to change these protocols to achieve these higher levels of throughput, the lower latencies that we need to be able to check somebody out at the cash register, we find two big problems. One of the big problems that I'll talk about next is at the network layer. The network layer has often been ignored, and therein lie a lot of problems on information dissemination. We have a lot of financial information in the hands of people who produce them. We have a lot of people who demand them. And connecting the two has been often overlooked. A lot of effort has gone into the crypto in cryptocurrencies and not into the network that powers them. We do not currently have an Akamai for cryptocurrencies. So what can we do? Well, okay, so what we would love to do is scale the network. So Bitcoin currently achieves about somewhere between 3 to 4 transactions per second. Ethereum achieves somewhere around 15 transactions per second. Visa achieves, on an average day, about 2,000 and has the ability to peak up to 50,000 transactions per second. So we need to find 3 orders of magnitude somewhere. We need to bring that into the picture. Where is that going to come from? Well, one option is to build systems that are perhaps centralized but untrusted. This is a portion of the design space that until now has been overlooked. That is, people have been trying to build these systems where everybody is an individual actor, there's absolutely no coordination between any parties, and there's absolutely no trust between any parties. What has been overlooked, what I would like to explore, are systems where there is a centralized party that operates a large number of nodes, but is not trusted, whose operation can be verified. Okay, so this is a different kind of system design. Business people typically provide a function and then say, trust me, I will give you this. So this is not that kind of design. This is, I'm going to give you something that you yourself can verify independent of me. It'll do what it says, and if it doesn't, you'll have proof that it didn't. So to this end, we've been building this infrastructure called BlocksRoute, whose purpose is to facilitate the sharing of financial information. So as I alluded to before, there typically are things like miners who produce blocks and merchants who need these blocks to see who paid whom. And vice versa, the miners themselves need the new transactions that need to go into new blocks. And that connection has not been done well to date. So the traditional approach in these systems is as follows. When you have a source of data and a peer that wants to consume that data and a bunch of nodes in the middle, and let's suppose that time is going down, the source ends up sending the data, let's say a block, to a relay in the middle. The relay receives it, then checks it. It takes some time to check that the data it received is good, and then forwards it on. So that process, of course, takes some time. It takes some time beta for transmitting the block, and some time alpha for checking that the block is good. So if you sum that up over n relays or so, you're going to see that we have a latency of about alpha, well, it's actually this, if you have n of these relays, of n times alpha plus beta. That's n hops. And so for every hop, you're paying a hefty cost of receiving, so that is storing first, checking, and then forwarding the data. So what can we do? Well, one of the things that we learned from computer networking in the 80s was that store and forward networks inherently are slow. And there's a very simple technique that we can bring to bear to this problem. So once again, if we have the same setup, and we have a relay in the middle, that relay need not actually store and then check and then forward the block. What it can do is it can start sending it as soon as it receives it. So that time period from the beginning of it actually receiving the data to the time when it starts sending it can be made tiny, the time it takes to make sure that, in this case, the block has a properly formatted header. So if you do that at scale to over n hops, you will find that the network has a very different characteristic. Instead of taking a rather hefty linear delay that is proportional to the amount of time it takes to forward a block, which is also a very, very large number, we can actually bring it down and decouple it from how long it takes to send the block. So I have some data, I start streaming it, and the first person to receive it starts streaming it as soon as he receives it, and so on and so forth. And as soon as I stop, he has it, and very shortly thereafter, the next person has it, and so forth. So this is the basis of a new network, a publish-subscribe network for financial information called BlocksRoute. And the elimination of that linear factor gives us an amazing advantage in how fast blocks are propagated. So this allows us to decouple the amount of time it takes to disseminate blocks from the size of the blocks themselves. So that allows us to have much, much larger blocks and therefore much higher throughput systems. So we've been deploying this on various different nodes. We have a giant network operations center, and we've been distributing data from people who have it to people who demand it in a manner that is auditable and checkable. Even though I'm not going to talk about those aspects of the system, I want to talk about where we get our performance advantages. So this is part of the work that my group did, looking at the often ignored network layer. But there is another layer up top, which is the consensus protocols. And the consensus protocols to date, there have been many. I'm sure you've heard of all sorts of things that people have tried to sort of repackage and sell to you. They all come down to fundamentally two different approaches. One of them is what we call classical family, is a family that has been studied for approximately 35 years or so. And this was pioneered by Leslie Lamport and Barbara Liskov, both of whom have Turing Awards. These are the classes of consensus protocols that power permissioned blockchains. So if you're doing an enterprise deployment, this is typically the kind of system that you are actually dealing with. Now, these systems all work by doing essentially this. Suppose we want to achieve some kind of consensus in a room, a closed room of this kind. Well, these require that we know exactly who's in the room. And once we know who's in the room, then we can determine exactly how many people must have heard of a message before it can be committed. I need to make sure that enough of you have heard of something so that that other person over there will definitely hear of that same thing when he asks, and therefore I can commit it safely, knowing that he too will have to necessarily commit it safely. So all of these correctness proofs come down to intersection and being able to argue that even in the presence of up to F Byzantine participants, Byzantine meaning participants who can do whatever they like, the participants who lie, who say one thing to him and another thing to me. Even in the presence of up to F participants, I know that another honest person will most definitely, with absolute guarantees, are going to hear about a particular transaction that I think has been finalized. So you can see from my description of how these systems work that this requires a very rather fragile setup. I need to know who's here. If he and I disagree about who exactly is in the room, then those overlaps and any safety criteria based on those overlaps will not work. So that's one of the reasons why when you guys do your enterprise deployments, you are unable to deploy them to groups larger than, to groups whose membership is unknown, to groups whose sizes are rather large. Now, the second problem, of course, is typically in these protocols, what needs to happen is I need to talk to everybody, and so does he, and so do you, and so does everybody else. And that requires n-squared communication. So if I were to try to use this with thousands of nodes, then the system would grind to a halt because there'd be millions of messages just to be able to commit somebody buying something at a cash register. And so that is, of course, not an acceptable solution strategy. So, and that's exactly why when EOS, for example, EOS uses a protocol in this family, and of course they are limited to about 21 nodes, because if they were to try to go to larger numbers, then that square factor would get them. Okay? Now, the thing that gave rise to this big revolution that all brought us all together in this room is another family of protocols found by the pseudonymous Satoshi Nakamoto person. So the Nakamoto consensus family works entirely differently. It says, look, it's too hard to try to keep track of who exactly is part of the system. It's too hard to decide who's got what. It's too hard it's too fragile to build systems of this kind. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create this blockchain using this technique called mining, where essentially we do a lottery. Okay? So you all try to solve a crypto puzzle, and somebody says, bingo, I've got a good solution. And that person then determines the next block. Okay, so that's the core of the Nakamoto family. It's incredibly robust. So another person could come into the room, we wouldn't even have to care about their identity, we wouldn't even know. And if they come up with a block, then they scream out bingo, and we add our block to our block, their block to our blockchain, and everything is great. So this is fantastic. The problem with the Nakamoto family of protocols, of course, is that the latencies are very high. So Bitcoin's latency is 10 minutes to add the next block. The throughputs are very low. It's 1 block per block interval. So in the case of Bitcoin, 1 megabytes per 10 minutes comes down to 3 to 4 transactions per second. And so that does not scale. That gives us those scalability limitations that we see. And worst of all, these systems are necessarily based on wasting a lot of energy. All these miners are constantly trying to solve these crypto puzzles to earn their rewards. And that, of course, creates a problem. We're consuming, I think yesterday's talk alluded to this, about 3 to 4 gigawatts. And if you want to visualize it, that's about 3 to 4 nuclear power plants. Or if you want to visualize it another way, that's about 2 Denmarks worth of electricity consumption is going into Bitcoin's blockchain production. That's a lot of energy, and sure, maybe some of it is coming from renewables and so forth, but no, that energy would not have gone to waste otherwise. We could have diverted it into functions that are more positive for society. So it would be fantastic to try to direct that energy elsewhere. Now, if you don't buy the sustainability and greenness argument, let me also mention the money argument, the greed argument. We have to pay these miners immense amounts of money to do that task. And they're wasting all that energy keeping each other at bay. So the work that they do to serialize blocks is actually quite minuscule compared to all the work that they're doing to come up with hashes that to compete with the other miners themselves. So what happened recently? Well, something really interesting happened about a month ago that you all should be aware of. A new paper was dropped on IPFS, and it outlines a completely different approach to the consensus problem. And it combines the best of these two families in a very unique, very interesting manner. Now, what is that? Well, this is a system that's called Avalanche, and it achieves the quick finality of Lamport-Liskov or classical consensus protocols. It achieves the high throughput, in fact, higher throughput than any of those, approximately somewhere between 1,000 transactions per second to 10,000 transactions per second in a geo-replicated setting. It scales to tens of thousands, maybe millions of nodes. It's robust. It doesn't require precise membership, like Nakamoto, and it's quiescent. When there is no decision to be made, it consumes no energy. It's green, it's sustainable, it gets rid of mining, it gets rid of the miner ecosystem, it gets rid of divisions of labor between the user community. There is no difference between me and you versus a miner. Okay, so the miners are gone. The core of this is, for those of you who have a distributed systems background, is an algorithm that is designed to be metastable, an algorithm that's designed not to remain in balance. When it comes to consensus protocols, balance is absolutely your biggest enemy. You don't want the protocol to sort of be flipping and flopping and be wishy and washy between two different choices. It should quickly topple over to one decision or the other. So, for example, in a choice between two colors, red versus blue, the protocol should just go to either red or blue. In fact, we don't care which one it picks, but we very much care that it quickly picks one of them. So, okay, so let me just try to give you sort of a hint of how these systems work. So many of you might have seen very long-winded descriptions of classical consensus protocols. You might have seen these like 60-plus page documents on proof-of-stake protocols in the past that are inscrutable. In fact, many cryptographers at the last financial cryptography conference were sitting around the table, scratching our heads and saying, it's been 2 years of these proof-of-stake protocols. Nobody trusts anybody else's proof-of-stake protocol. And somehow, the authors of any one paper are highly critical of the authors of every other paper. We have no visibility into what's going on here. What's happening? Can't we have a simpler protocol? Well, this is a much simpler protocol, and it's something that I want to sort of outline for you in the space of the next 5 minutes or so. I think all of you should be able to leave here knowing exactly how Avalanche works and what the intuition is behind it. So we're going to be building a new platform based on Avalanche. We're going to be building a new currency called AvaCoin. It's going to be a payments rail, a transaction rail, and a computation rail. It's going to support smart contracts as well as payments, and it's going to support them at a scale that's unheard of with a level of decentralization that's previously unseen in cryptocurrencies. And at the core of it is this new protocol. So here's how it works. It's very, very straightforward. We start in a very large crowded room, or maybe let's actually make it bigger. Imagine you're in a very, very large stadium to 50 to 100,000 people. You don't necessarily know everybody in the stadium, of course. And in fact, you and I might differ on who exactly is in the stadium. And that's completely okay. The way this protocol works is everybody, when it's their turn, they just pick up, okay, it's my time now. Just looks around, picks 5 people at random, maybe 5 to 10. So it's a giant room, you don't know who's there, you just pick like 5 to 10 people, and you say, hey, in a choice between red and blue, which color do you prefer? Okay, so imagine that everybody has a color on their forehead, and so you ask these people, which color do you like? And so they come back to you and they say, okay, well, I like red, red, blue, red, blue. And at that point you say, okay, it looks like there is a slight dominance of red in the network, at least as far as I've sampled it, and I'm going to flip my color to red myself. Okay? So that guy changes color. And it's then, at the same time, actually, it turns out, at the same time, somebody else is doing the same thing somewhere else in the network. This other node here is sampling, and he happens to also sample red in this case. And you can see that after a round of this, okay, the following will happen. The worst case scenario is we started out with a stadium that was 50-50 evenly divided. And the worst outcome would be that if the stadium would remain 50-50 divided forever. But the chances of that happening are tiny. Because what will happen after one round is there will be a slight preponderance of either red or blue based on random choices. We will end up oversampling either the red or the blue. We will go from 50-50 to 51-49, most likely. And after that, at the second round, we will likely go from 51-49 to 53-47. And you can quickly see that the network will develop more and more and more of that same color that initially ended up dominating. And then at some point in time, what we call the phase shift point, the network will begin to move faster and faster and faster towards the solution. And after a certain point in time, what we call the point of no return, the network is safe to commit that there might be some stragglers who are slow, but they too will most definitely end up sampling the exact same color. They too will not be able to go back to the initial bivalent state. So you can see that the shape of this decision curve looks exactly like this, and the chances of remaining at that apex are tiny after a modest number of rounds. It turns out the math shows that after about 11 to 17 rounds in a stadium as big as 50,000, you will look around the stadium, and everybody will have independently performed this really dumb protocol, really simple protocol, and you look around this ginormous stadium, and everybody is holding a red card on their foreheads. That's an amazing result. It's very, very robust, and it doesn't require any kind of membership, any kind of precise knowledge about who's in the system. It's egalitarian. It's green. And so what does that mean? There's no miners, there's no mining, and everybody is at the same level. Okay? You participate in the system by buying some stake. You get some AVA coins to say, okay, here, I am putting these coins up here to show that I am an independent individual, that I am not a million copies of the same person. And so that's a useful feature to keep out an actor who might otherwise pretend to be a million other people and crowd out the reasonable voices in the room. So with that stake that's set out to show that you have some skin in the game, you get to have a voice in the system. And with that voice, you get to determine the decisions made by the system. The system overall, I don't have time to go into the technical details, the system overall constructs not a blockchain, but a directed acyclic graph. So at the same time, you're building a giant graph of transactions, A paid, B paid, C paid, D, that kind of a graph. And that allows us to have maximal concurrency. So multiple people working at the same time can be extending this giant ledger that is in the shape of a graph as opposed to a single linear structure. That single linear structure has an inherent or creates an inherent bottleneck. So I will be showing you some numbers that are very, very fast. And one of the reasons why they're fast is this optimization based on the graph. But the core idea here that made it possible was this metastability. Now, in Silicon Valley, it's sort of, you have to seem wise. And one of the ways in which people seem wise is by saying, well, you can't have a free lunch. There always has to be a catch. So for one, that's false, okay? So that's just something that people say to appear like they know what they're talking about. It's not actually true. You can easily have protocols that dominate other protocols in every way possible. Okay, we've seen this many times in distributed systems. Now, it turns out in this case, there is a bit of a catch if you want to view it as a catch, but it actually isn't a catch. It turns out that there is one thing that this protocol cannot do, which is if there is a sufficiently large attacker in the system, then the attacker is capable of issuing two transactions where Alice pays Bob and Alice pays Charlie at the same time. And then the attacker is able to keep the system from deciding between those two. That is, every time the system is veering from that balance point, if the attacker is big enough, perhaps the attacker can pull the system back. This turns out not to be a problem because the only person affected with this limitation is the attacker himself. Okay, so it's an interesting way to sort of try to ball up all of this badness that has to go somewhere in the system and to put it on the shoulders of the misbehaving party here. So there's this, the lack of liveness in the presence of an attack is something that only affects the attacker and not honest transactions. So, okay, so what are we doing with this? Well, we're looking forward to building a new coin. This new coin is going to be called Ava coin. It's going to support multiple virtual machines. So there's going to be Ava, the native token, which supports very simple operations. And on top of this, anybody can create their own coins of any kind that they like. In particular, though, we would like them to be able to create Ava BTC, for Bitcoin, or Ava Ethereum, or Ava Zcash, or Ava Monero, and so forth. We would like to be able to support the Bitcoin script, the Ethereum virtual machine, Zcash's ZK snarks, Monero's ring signatures, and so forth. There is no real reason why not. As long as you have isolation set properly in your implementation, there's absolutely no downside to supporting multiple virtual machines, and it's very, very advantageous to do so. I alluded to how stake can push back on the power of an attacker to try to mess with the system. In reality, though, we expect that once you have a good enough reason to push back on the attacker, the attacks don't even arise in the first place. Okay, so we have seen in public deployments, the attacks, you don't see them at all until they appear, they appear only when guaranteed to succeed. Let's see. One of the most interesting parts of this protocol is the governance scheme. So the way this protocol works, which is subsampled voting, subsampled questioning of the crowd to try to achieve consensus, is quite amenable to polling the crowd to find out what it is that they are willing to go with. And that is the basis by which we can use the protocol to determine meta properties, properties of the protocol itself. So by that, I'm referring to, of course, one of the most important meta properties, the determination of one of the most important properties, and that is the interest rate. So in Ava, you can have transactions that say something like, hey, everybody, I think that we are minting too many coins. We would like to pull back on the rate at which we mint. or vice versa. We are not minting enough coins. We should provide more incentives to people to join the system, to put up a stake, and to participate. So we should crank up the interest rate. In contrast, Satoshi had to come up with his emissions curve, with his minting curve, way ahead of time. In 2009, he had to fix that curve that issues a sum total of 21 million coins. And he got it right sometimes, and he got it very wrong some other times. Sometimes demand outpaces the curve, the price goes through the roof, and you can decide whether that's good or not. Typically, most people consider that to be bad for a stable currency. And other times, much worse, is demand lags and the price tanks. And it would be much better to be able to not have to bake that in. And it's difficult to do so. But this approach to protocol design allows us to do exactly that. So when people talk about consensus protocols, they typically have this notion in their heads that that these consensus protocols find the emergent consensus. That's not what happens in Bitcoin. You pick a miner and then he tells you what he likes. There is no notion of an emergent consensus in Bitcoin. But in Ava there is. So you can do exactly that with Ava. Okay, so this governing is going to happen through repeated sampled voting. There's, of course, going to be some reasonable ranges, so you can't move the system to an undesirable point of operation. Let's see. So we would like to be able to enable people to create their own tokens. I would very much like other tokens to be able to switch to Ava. So this new consensus mechanism, it's green, it's better than in every respect than mining-based coins. So if you are, for example, if you are Zcash, you would benefit immediately from switching to Avalanche. Right? Zcash currently is emitting way too many coins and should not be doing so. And it also needs a differentiator that sets it aside from Bitcoin and other copycats. Let's see. So this gives us the ability to achieve unprecedented decentralization. So Bitcoin and Ethereum, as I showed before, comes down to about 20 concerns that operate together. Well, here now we can have thousands upon thousands of people participating in the system. So there are always going to be some people who like proof of work. So some people really fell in love with the idea. I did too initially when I read the Satoshi paper. And those people really like the security that comes from POW. Well, those people could still benefit from Avalanche by layering it on top. Avalanche could come up with the decisions about the mempool. When there's a double spend in the mempool, Avalanche, within the course of a few seconds, can make a decision as to which of the transactions should go into the next block, and then the miners with a soft fork can enact that. So if you really like your POW, well, okay, you could still take advantage of this new mechanism. So let's see. I have some time, so let me give you my quick rant on enterprise blockchains. Many of you are working on proofs of concept on enterprise blockchains. Many of you are dealing with these super fragile classical consensus protocols. And many of you are doing it wrong. Let me also mention that. Many of you are deploying a single monoculture of code across a modest number of nodes, across a dozen nodes. So that alone sort of rubs me the wrong way as a distributed systems person, because these systems are supposed to fail independently. And if you're running the same code on all of them, I'm sorry, but you have a giant single point of failure across all of them. You're doing it completely wrong. So, but let's leave that aside. Maybe 5 to 10 years from now, you will have multiple implementations of the same code base, of the same interface, and maybe you'll get that right. But I assure you that your business models are actually not very well aligned with the kinds of consortia deployments that classical systems require. If me and you are about to go into business, we typically look at each other in the eye, we create a bilateral relationship. But with enterprise blockchains, we have a very different model. You and I are supposed to look at each other in the eye, and then we go, okay, let's have our records be kept by Deloitte, Latouche, and this and that, PwC, et cetera, et cetera. We somehow have to then determine a Greek chorus that works on our behalf to keep our records. And every time you and I transact, we're supposed to turn to this Greek chorus and say, I paid you $5, do you guys acknowledge? And they're supposed to say, yes, we acknowledge. This is a crazy way of setting things up. And no wonder very few POCs have actually moved into production, because no sane company would like to deploy in this manner. If this Greek chorus today isn't charging you money, well, tomorrow they will, because you put them in a monopolistic situation. You have to pay a rather large number of nodes, more than one, 5 to 10 or more, for keeping your records. So whatever you used to pay yourself, now you have to pay 5-fold to 10-fold to somebody else. And so that setup, I find, is going to be a very problematic one. And I suspect that many enterprise blockchains will stumble at the gate after very successful POCs. POCs will succeed and production will not move. And that's exactly what we've seen for the last few years. Ava is the right platform for these things because you can actually move the data to such a decentralized fashion that you are not beholden to a monopoly, that you and I don't have to create that fragile consortium. So we also are, of course, going after smart contracts. That's an immense new area for us. And if we get this right, we have the ability to scale them up by about 1,000-fold. And that, of course, allows us to have CryptoKitties simultaneously with a very popular ICO, something that has eluded the existing smart contract platforms. Okay, let me give you just a couple of brief glimpses into some very conservative numbers. So you can see here that the system is capable of achieving about 1,600 transactions per second in a deployment of geographically dispersed deployment of about 2,000 nodes. Here is latency. The very first one is Bitcoin. That's 3,600 seconds. Okay, so that's 1 hour if you want a really secure confirmation. The equivalent for Ethereum is about 37 confirmations, comes out to about 550 seconds or so, okay, 10 minutes. And there is a very interesting system by a highly respected colleague of mine, Silvio Micali at MIT, and his system, Algar, achieves, after using very fancy crypto, in the classical context where you have to know all the participants, achieves about latencies of about 50 seconds. And so that's still, in my opinion, unusable. I would not like to wait behind somebody buying coffee at 50 seconds. Avalanche is capable of doing this somewhere between, I think this is a very conservative number of 4 seconds. Other experiments that we did range from 1.2 to 1.7, again, in a geo-replicated setting. Okay, so where are we today? Well, we stand poised to transform how business is conducted through tokenization. If we entirely fail, if the entire blockchain area goes away, and all we have done is come up with new technologies for keeping track of custodial financial assets, then it will still have been a ginormous improvement for mankind. But I think we're going to succeed even beyond that. We're going to succeed far beyond what anybody else has foreseen. The big stumbling blocks to this success are twofold. They're performance and scale. And to date, the focus on decentralization has kept us from achieving the performance and scale that we need to really reach this dream. The narrative that has been sold is really compelling, but the technology on the ground in the trenches is unable to get there. So with these kinds of new technological improvements, I suspect that we're beginning to finally crack this puzzle, that we know what to do at the network level to get the information from the people who have it to the people who demand it very fast, and to achieve consensus in a manner that's egalitarian, green, and super low latency and high throughput. So with that, if you have any questions, I'll be in the area, in the conference later on, and very happy to chat with anybody who's interested in Avalanche. Thank you very much.